A woman hugs her son in 1931. At first glance, it's nothing more than a quiet, tender moment captured in black and white. But if you lean in, if you let your eyes linger on the boy's face, something begins to feel strangely unsettlingly wrong. Dr. Margaret Chen adjusted her reading glasses as she studied the photograph that had arrived at the Smithsonian's archives that morning. It was dated 1931, a simple print of a woman in a plain cotton dress bending to embrace a boy of perhaps 8. They stood before a weathered wooden fence, the endless flat horizon of rural Kansas, stretching behind them like a pale, silent ocean. A modest farmhouse, a mother and her child. Just another Depression-era family photo. That's what Margaret told herself, whispering the words almost as a reassurance, while she noted the woman's worn shoes and the boy's patched clothing, the quiet evidence of hard times. And yet, something about this picture refused to sit quietly. The photograph had been donated by the estate of Elenina Hartwell, a woman long gone, along with a box of family relics from the early 20th century. Margaret reached for her magnifying glass, intending only to examine the paper for preservation. But her hand hesitated in midair. The mother's face was exactly as one might expect, soft, devoted, protective. Arms wrapped around the child in a gesture of simple love. But the boy was different. Margaret leaned closer until the edge of the photograph almost touched her breath. While the woman gazed downward with unmistakable affection, the child's eyes seemed to look through the camera, straight and unblinking, as if he knew something the adults did not. There was no innocent curiosity there. Instead, an intensity, calculated, watchful, far too old for an 8-year-old. His small hands hung rigid at his sides, refusing the warmth of his mother's embrace. Strange, Margaret murmured, shifting the desk lamp to sharpen the light across the boy's face. The more she looked, the more uneasy she felt. Was it only the shadow of the era hardship etched into a young face, or was it something deeper, something no camera should have been able to capture? Margaret opened her research log and wrote a quiet note. Unusual family photograph. Recommend further investigation into the Hartwell family history. She could not have guessed that this single image would open a door. Sealed for more than 90 years, a door that led to questions about the power of mother's love and the dangerous secrets that families bury in plain sight. 3 days later, the photograph still haunted her. And so, on a grey morning, Margaret found herself steering along the winding roads of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Her destination, a sprawling Victorian house once owned by Elenina Hartwell herself. The woman who had preserved the photograph had died at the age of 97, leaving behind a meticulously organized estate and a reputation in the small town of Millfield as someone who lived quietly but deliberately. What truths had she taken to her grave? The front door opened before Margaret could knock. Standing there was Sarah Morrison, Eleanor's great niece. Sarah was in her 40s with kind eyes and brown hair, streaked with grey pulled back into a practical ponytail. A librarian from Philadelphia, she had taken leave from work to settle her great-aunt's affairs. "I'm so glad someone from the Smithsonian is interested in Aunt Eleanor's collection," Sarah said warmly, motioning Margaret inside. The house felt like a time capsule that had never been disturbed. Hardwood floors creaked beneath their steps as they wandered through rooms scented faintly of cedar and old paper. The walls were crowded with framed portraits, faces from long ago staring back in silent witness. Many of the photographs were neatly mounted, each one labeled in Elelanina's careful handwriting. Dates, names, places. Eleanor never married, Sarah explained softly, and she never had children of her own. But she devoted her life to preserving our family's story. She used to say that photographs were windows into souls, that if you looked closely enough, they revealed truths people might rather keep hidden. Margaret felt a small shiver trace her spine. Was that what the boy in the photograph was trying to do? Reveal a truth too terrible to name? And if so, what would they find if they dared to look even closer? They reached Elelanina's study, a quiet shadowed room where time itself seemed to pause. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves pressed in from every side, their wooden frames heavy with the scent of paper and dust. A large oak desk waited near the window, its surface scattered with magnifying glasses, brittle photo albums and notebooks thick with unanswered questions. It felt less like an office and more like a shrine to memory. Sarah crossed the room and lifted a leather-bound journal from the desk. "This might interest you," she said softly, placing it in Margaret's hands. "Aunt Elelanina's research notes about the 1931 photograph you mentioned on the phone. She spent years trying to understand that single image." Margaret opened the journal with careful fingers. Page after page of neat looping handwriting revealed dates, sketches, and restless observations. One entry written in darker ink as though the pen had pressed harder that day stopped her cold. "The boy in mother's arms. Why do his eyes hold such darkness? What did he know that we never understood? The truth about Thomas must be somewhere in these photographs." Margaret whispered the name aloud. "Thomas." She lifted her gaze to Sarah. Who was Thomas? Sarah's expression shifted the question, pulling a shadow across her face. "That's just it," she said quietly. "We're not entirely sure." A few minutes later, they sat together in the old kitchen, the air rich with the faint aroma of coffee from an aging percolator. Sarah poured 2 cups and set them on the wooden table, while Margaret spread several photographs across the surface. Afternoon sunlight filtered through lace curtains, breaking into delicate patterns that slid across the images like moving ghosts. "What I'm about to tell you may sound strange," Sarah began, settling into her chair as though bracing herself. "Growing up, I overheard whispers among the older relatives about a boy named Thomas. They said he lived with my great-grandmother Ruth Hartwell in the early 1930s. But no two stories ever matched. Some claimed he was Ruth's son who died young of influenza. Others insisted he wasn't her child at all, just a boy she was caring for, temporarily. And a few, usually the ones who lowered their voices the most, said Thomas never existed at all, that the photograph showed an entirely different child. Margaret looked down once more at the 1931 image, at the boy's unsettling stare. "And what did Elelanina believe?" she asked. "That's what makes this so strange," Sarah replied, reaching into a manila envelope. "Aunt Eleanor found another photograph last year tucked away in the attic. She thought it might change everything." She slid the second photograph across the table. It too bore the date 1931, though the seasonal clothing suggested it was taken several months later. This time, Ruth Hartwell stood alone in front of the farmhouse. Her shoulders seemed to sag beneath an invisible weight, her clasped hands drawn tight against her skirt. The boy, whoever he was nowhere to be seen. Turn it over, Sarah urged. Margaret flipped the photo carefully the back, marked with a line of faded ink. After Thomas left us, may God forgive what we allowed to happen. A chill prickled along Margaret's spine. Left. But your relatives said he died of influenza. Exactly, Sarah said grimly. That's when Aunt Eleanor realized our family had been keeping secrets for nearly a century. She became obsessed with uncovering the truth, who Thomas really was, where he came from, and most importantly, what happened to him. Margaret drew her notebook closer, the pen trembling slightly between her fingers. Did she discover anything else? Sarah hesitated. Then with a slow breath, she reached for a third photograph resting beneath the others. She found this hidden behind the frame of an old mirror in the attic, Sarah said. It's dated 2 weeks before the first photograph was taken. Margaret held the image to the light. It showed Ruth Hartwell again, but the child at her side was not the same. This boy had lighter hair and a smile so bright, so genuine, it almost glowed against the paper. 2 boys, 2 faces, 2 impossible truths. What story was this family trying so desperately to conceal? And which of these children, if either, was Thomas? The resemblance between Ruth and the second child was impossible to ignore so close. It felt like looking into a mirror that showed a life that might have been. This, Sarah had said quietly, is Ruth's real son James. He had, she said, died of pneumonia in early 1931, only days after that bright photograph was taken. Margaret went back to Washington with the 3 photographs and Elena Nena's careful, haunted notes tucked under her arm. Her head buzzed with questions that would not quiet. The next morning she called Dr. James Patterson, a colleague who spent his days coaxing truth out of old paper and fading silver. He worked at Georgetown, surrounded by instruments that made the past visible again. I need you to look at these very closely, she told him when they met in his lab. Everything paper emulsions, any sign of tampering. James was the kind of man who loved small certainties. He set the first photograph beneath a high-powered digital microscope, the image blooming on the computer monitor until every grain of silver halide looked like a landscape of tiny hills. Interesting, he murmured after a long silence. The print is authentic paper chemical composition, all consistent with 1931. But the image quality, there's something unusual. Margaret leaned in, drawn to the pale glow of the screen. What do you mean? James pointed without taking his eyes off the monitor. He'd enlarged the boy's face until the pixels became a strange kind of script. See her around the child's face, he said. The grain structure is subtly different. It's faint, but it suggests that part of the image underwent some additional processing, some extra exposure or development beyond the rest of the print. He moved to the second photograph, Ruth alone in front of the farmhouse. Nothing odd there, a plain, straightforward picture taken with the ordinary camera of its day. Then he brought up the third photograph, the one with Ruth's biological son James. This time his tone shifted. A spark of excitement crept in. Margaret, look. He overlaid the 2 images on the screen, nudging and twisting them until the horizons matched. Fence posts lined up. Shadows fell the same way. Even the farmhouse sat in the same place in the frame. Compare her dress here, he said, zooming closer. There's a small tear near her left shoulder, visible in both images. and this scuff on her shoe there as well. It was as if two different afternoons had somehow been stitched into one memory. The photographs, dated months apart, bore the same tiny stubborn marks of a single moment. I think these were taken much closer in time than the dates suggest, James said softly. Possibly within hours. Margaret felt a small cold flutter in her chest, an old private fear waking. If the evidence could be trusted, then the story the family told themselves might be a careful, constructed thing. She needed to know more. So she went to Millfield, Kansas, where the Hartwells had lived in 1931. Millfield was the kind of small farming town that keeps its past folded into the present dusty record books, names written in the same careful hand for generations. The population now numbered under 2,000, but the town hall still held ledger after ledger from the Depression years. There she met Mary Kowalski, the town clerk, 70-something, steady, and full of local memory. Mary's grandfather had been the town doctor in the 1930s. The girl who had been a town then had become the woman who remembered everything. Oh yes, Mary said, turning the pages as if they were pages of a life. I heard the stories about Ruth. My grandfather delivered her baby in 1923. A sweet boy, but always a little sickly. He came down with pneumonia that winter of 1931. It broke poor Ruth's heart. Margaret laid the photographs before her. Mary studied them with the sort of attention that only familiarity can teach. "This is definitely Ruth," she said, pointing at the woman in the pictures. "And this?" She touched the photograph of Ruth with the sandy-haired boy that looks just like little James. He had that same hair, the gentleness in his face. But when Mary looked at the photograph that had started it, all the one with Ruth and the dark-haired child, her expression shifted. The woman frowned as if trying to place the face among the thousands she once knew. "This child," Mary said slowly, "I don't recognize him. I knew every family around here in those years. We watched over one another's children. I would have known him." She paused, fingers hovering over the photograph, studying the boy's face as if a name might rise from the paper if she only looked long enough. Who was he? Where had he come from? And why? If James had died, was there another child in Ruth's arms, in that other picture a child the town could not place? The question settled in the quiet room, like dust motes turning slowly in the slant of light. What would you do if you found a photograph that refused to tell you a simple truth? "There's something about his eyes," Mary whispered, tracing the boy's face with a careful fingertip. "They're unsettling. Almost like he's much older than he looks." She rose from her chair and crossed to a tall dented filing cabinet. Its drawers groaned as she pulled out a folder marked 1931, Birth and Death Records. Running her finger down a neat column of looping handwriting, she nodded. "James Hartwell? Yes. Died February 15th, 1931. Her finger stopped. "But here's what troubles me. There's no record of any other child living with Ruth that year. No adoption papers, no temporary custody. Nothing." Mary looked up, her eyes sharpened by quiet concern. "According to every official record we have after James died, Ruth Hartwell lived alone on that farm until she moved to Pennsylvania later in 1931. Yet you're showing me photographs that say otherwise." A faint chill slipped along Margaret's skin. "Is there anyone else in town who might remember those days?" Mary tapped the folder thoughtfully. "Frank Morrison. He's 94 now, lives at the assisted living facility on the edge of town. His family owned the farm next to the Hartwells. If anyone remembers a strange boy at Ruth's place, it would be Frank, the Millfield assisted. Living Center was modest, but lovingly kept, the kind of place where sunlight clings to polished floors and quiet voices linger in the halls. Frank Morrison sat near a wide window that framed a small garden, his wheelchair angled toward the fading afternoon light. Despite his years, his eyes remained sharp bright, with the stubborn clarity of someone who has carried memories too long. When Margaret placed the photographs in his hands, his reaction was immediate, almost physical. Dear God. He breathed, his fingers trembling as they traced the image of Ruth with the dark-haired boy. I never thought I'd see that child's face again. Margaret pulled a chair beside him. You remember this boy? Frank nodded slowly. Thomas. That's what Ruth called him, though I doubt that was his real name. He appeared at Ruth's farm not long after young James died, maybe a week or two. Ruth was nearly mad with grief, and then suddenly, there was this boy. Where did he come from? Margaret asked. That's the thing, Frank said, his voice lowering as though the walls might still carry secrets. Nobody knew. Ruth claimed she was caring for him temporarily, that his family had fallen on hard times. But the boy... Frank's gaze drifted to some far corner of the garden, as if the child might still be standing there. There was something wrong with him, deeply wrong. He described how Thomas rarely spoke, and when he did, his words carried a weight, a sophistication far beyond his supposed age. He would stare at people, Frank said, with an intensity that made grown men uneasy. And he seemed to know things, private things about neighbors' lives, even events from before he supposedly arrived in Millfield. Animals too seemed to sense something. My family's dog would whimper and hide whenever Thomas came near. Even Ruth's old milk cow would kick and snort if he approached. Animals know, Frank added softly. They always know. Margaret laid the photograph of Ruth standing alone on his lap. What happened to Thomas? Frank's expression darkened the light in his eyes, dimming to memory. He disappeared one night in late summer 1931. Ruth never spoke of it. But the next morning she was changed. Relieved maybe, but haunted. Within a few months, she left Millfield and never returned. Was he reported missing? Margaret asked. That's the strangest part, Frank replied, leaning closer. No one seemed to care. It was as if the whole town silently agreed to forget he'd ever been there. Even Ruth behaved as though he had never existed. Frank's voice fell to a whisper. But there's something I've never told a soul. 3 days after Thomas disappeared, I was walking past the Hartwell farm. I saw Ruth in the backyard digging deep behind the barn. She worked through the night by lantern light. The words clung to Margaret's thoughts long after she left the facility. She called Sarah Morrison at once, her voice tight with urgency. Within hours they were on the road together, heading toward the land where the Hartwell farmhouse once stood. The property, long abandoned and now leased to a local farming corporation, lay silent beneath an endless Kansas sky. Robert Jensen, the current landowner, a practical man in his 60s, met them at the gate. He'd grown up hearing stories of the cursed Hartwell place and offered his help without hesitation, even lending them the ground-penetrating radar he used to check irrigation lines. The farmhouse itself was little more than a ruin. The roof had collapsed years ago, and the wooden siding had weathered to a lifeless grey. But the stone foundation remained stubborn and unbroken, and the old barn still stood, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. Margaret and Sarah spent the morning pacing the overgrown fields, photographs in hand, matching each shadow and rise of earth to the backgrounds captured in 1931. Despite decades of wind and neglect, they found it the slight rise of ground where Ruth had posed with both boys, a vantage point that still offered a clear view of the silent house. Frank said Ruth was digging behind the barn, Margaret reminded Sarah as they approached the weathered structure. The boards creaked softly in the Kansas wind, as if the barn itself remembered. What if anything still waited beneath that earth? And if Thomas had truly been forgotten by everyone, but the photographs? What might the soil choose to remember? The grass behind the barn swayed in the rising wind, as if it already knew what lay beneath. Robert Jensen wheeled the ground-penetrating radar into position, the machine humming softly like an old motor. Its display flickered with shifting grey patterns, shadows of what rested below. "There," Robert said, suddenly stopping the unit mid-pass. His brow furrowed as he studied the screen. "Something's definitely buried here. About 4 feet down, roughly rectangular." Margaret's breath caught. "How big?" Robert hesitated, glancing back at the monitor. "About the size of a large suitcase," or he paused clearly. Uneasy, it could be a small casket. Sarah tightened her grip on Margaret's arm. "You don't think—" Margaret kept her voice steady. "There's only one way to find out. We call the sheriff. If there are human remains, we do this properly." As they waited, the wind sharpened, threading through the broken windows of the farmhouse. The tall grass hissed and bent, carrying a sound that felt almost like a child's voice, high distant and far too knowing. Margaret shivered. 90 years of silence seemed to lean closer, listening. Sheriff David Martinez arrived within the hour, his patrol car crunching over the gravel drive. With him came the county coroner and a small forensic team led by Dr. Linda Chen, a calm, precise anthropologist who had worked on century-old cases before, but never anything quite like this. "We proceed carefully," Dr. Chen instructed as her team set up floodlights and evidence tables. "If there are human remains, they'll be fragile. And if this is a crime scene, every grain of soil matters." The excavation began. First came the slow peeling back of topsoil, each layer brushed away by hand once the radar depth was reached. Margaret and Sarah stood at the perimeter, hearts pounding with each scrape of a trowel. Hours stretched thin until finally, a technician called out, "We've got something." Dr. Chen knelt at the pit's edge, brushing away the final film of dirt. The faint outline of wood emerged corners, rough and uneven as if hammered together in desperate haste. "This wasn't made by a professional carpenter," Dr. Chen observed quietly. "Whoever built it worked quickly and under stress." Sheriff Martinez photographed every angle before the box was lifted from the soil. Time had darkened the wood and rusted the simple latch, but it remained intact, stubbornly holding its secret. "Before we open this," the sheriff warned, "everyone needs to understand what we might be looking at. If these are human remains, this could be a crime frozen since 1931. The latch creaked open beneath Dr. Chen's careful hands. Inside lay a bundle of once white cloth, now mottled with earth and age. As she drew the fabric aside, the unmistakable outline of a small skeleton appeared. But the discovery did not bring relief, only a deeper unease. Dr. Chen's practiced expression shifted to something unsettled. She leaned closer, adjusting her magnifying lens. This is unusual. Sheriff Martinez stepped forward. Unusual how? These bones don't match the size, she murmured. The proportions suggest a much older individual despite the small frame. Bone density skull formation. This isn't consistent with a child of any age. Margaret and Sarah exchanged a bewildered glance. Even without training, they could see it too. The skull was subtly wrong angles, sharper sutures thicker than they should be. And the teeth. Look here, Dr. Chen said, pointing with the tip of a gloved finger. The dental structure doesn't belong to a child at all. These teeth belong to someone far older, someone who should have been fully grown. The barnyard fell silent except for the restless wind. In that uneasy hush, the old stories of Millfield seemed to stir awake. Whispering of a boy who spoke too wisely, who vanished without a trace, and a mother who dug through the night as if trying to bury more than just a body. The teeth were unmistakably adult, broad, fully erupted, yet they sat in a skull no larger than that of a 10-year-old. It was a contradiction that unsettled even the most seasoned members of the forensic team. While Dr. Chen continued her careful analysis in the Kansas afternoon light, Margaret's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Georgetown. It was James Patterson. Margaret. His voice carried the thrill of discovery. I've been digging into rare medical conditions that might explain what you've described. Based on the skeletal anomalies, I believe you may be looking at a case of progeria, or something very much like it. Margaret repeated the unfamiliar word. James explained patiently. Progeria is an extremely rare genetic disorder that accelerates aging in children. They're born healthy, but their bodies age at many times the normal rate. In the 1930s, medicine barely had a name for it. Imagine a child whose bones harden like an adult's before they've lost their baby teeth. He hesitated before adding, "There's more." I located a 1930 case study from a Nebraska state facility. A boy named Timothy Walsh, diagnosed only as a medical curiosity, escaped under mysterious circumstances. He was reported to have advanced progeria and a mind far beyond his years. Margaret felt the air tighten around her. Beyond his years, how? Staff described him as manipulative, calculating. A child who could read adult emotions, anticipate decisions, even exploit fears. Imagine meeting someone who looks like a frail child but speaks with the insight of a grown man. In 1931, that would have seemed otherworldly. The pieces began to lock into place. "James," she said softly, "send me those records." I think Timothy Walsh and the boy Ruth, called Thomas, may be the same person. When the call ended, Margaret shared the revelation with Sarah, the Kansas wind still brushing the barn's weathered boards. What had once seemed supernatural now took on the shape of a devastating medical truth. "So Thomas Timothy died here?" Sarah asked. "It seems likely," Margaret said. "Ruth must have taken him in after her own son's death. When Timothy's condition claimed him, she panicked. In 1931, no one would have understood progeria. They might have accused her of anything. So she buried him quietly, giving him the dignity no institution ever would." 3 weeks later, Margaret and Sarah stood in the book-lined study of Elela Nena Hartwell, surrounded by town documents, medical records, and decades of painstaking notes. The final picture was heartbreakingly clear. The forensic analysis confirmed it. The remains belonged to a boy about 10 years old in chronological age, yet with the bone density and dental structure of someone far older. DNA testing, remarkably successful despite the passage of time, matched with descendants of the Walsh family in Nebraska. Thomas was Timothy. Sarah read aloud from Elelanina's final journal entry. Ruth saved that poor boy from a lifetime of institutional horror. When his suffering ended, she gave him the only mercy. The world would not, a quiet burial and her unspoken love. Margaret arranged for Timothy Walsh to be reinterred in the Millfield Cemetery. The new headstone bore a simple inscription agreed upon by the Walsh descendants and the Hartwell family. Timothy Walsh, 1920-1931. A child who knew too much suffering, finally at peace. The infamous 1931 photograph now told a different story. Ruth's gaze was not haunted, it was tender. The boy's unsettling eyes were not malevolent. They were the weary eyes of a child whose body betrayed him while his mind raced ahead. Ruth was a hero, Margaret said, quietly slipping the photograph into an archival sleeve bound for the Smithsonian. In an age when fear ruled over understanding, she chose compassion. She gave a dying child love, dignity, and a place to rest. The image that once chilled her now seemed gentle. Where others once saw something unnatural, Margaret saw only what Ruth had seen all along, a suffering child who deserved to be remembered, not for the strangeness of his appearance, but for the humanity he inspired. Sometimes Margaret thought, mystery is nothing more than the shadow of knowledge we have not yet reached. And when understanding finally arrives, the darkness is revealed for what it always was, a place where compassion waited quietly to be seen.